Hello, welcome to the next lesson. Today we're going to get into Act 2 of the play. It's very exciting to be moving along, but I wanted to pause here a moment to kind of do a quick review from Lesson 1. Lesson 1, I introduced some of the ideas from Aristotle on what makes a tragedy. I want us to check right now and see, is Romeo and Juliet following this rule of Aristotle? So we need a few things. First of all, we talked about, or we considered, what makes a tragedy tragic and not just sad. What we need is a tragic character. Now, so far we have Romeo. Is Romeo a tragic character? What he needs to be a tragic character, according to Aristotle, is he has to have a tragic flaw. I think what we're seeing with Romeo is he has a tragic flaw of being too confident. We can see that already. We're going to start to identify that his confidence is suggested to come from his being young. Now we're going to meet Juliet in more detail, and we have to look to see, is Juliet a tragic figure or not? And I think that we'll see that she is. Another thing that Aristotle says is that we need to have a point of discovery, where the character's going along and then they find out that they've gotten themselves into some kind of trouble. We know this already because at the end of Act 1, Romeo and Juliet learn that one is the Capulet and one is a Montague from the two families. That's a point of discovery. I wanted to add one more thing to this that we haven't talked about. Another quality of drama is that drama should have what's called the 3 unities. Unity of time, unity of place, and unity of action. Now, does Romeo and Juliet have this? So far it seems like it does. Unity of place is that it takes place in Verona. They don't travel all over the world, they're in one location. Unity of action. This play is all centered around one idea, the love of Romeo and Juliet. It doesn't have a lot of different plots. There's a few subplots that we'll talk about, but mainly it centers around one action. Lastly, does it have a unity in time? Yes, the play, which we haven't finished, but we'll see that it all happens in just a few days. Okay, let's go ahead and get into Act 2, and we notice in Act 2 that it begins with the chorus. This will be the last chorus in the play. There's not a chorus in Act 3, 4, or 5. So the chorus here does what it's supposed to do. It sums up the action so far. Let's look at just a few key lines from the chorus. We see first of all the idea of that dichotomy between the old and the young again in the play. Now old desire doth in his deathbed lie, old desire and young affection gapes to be his heir. Old desire, young affection. This is going to continue throughout the play, as we've already seen. We also learn about Juliet. Why does she like Romeo? The quote is, the charm of his looks. Romeo is a good-looking guy. Later on, the nurse is going to tell us that Romeo is very handsome. So that might be part of Juliet's flaw to make her tragic, is that she cares too much about a guy's looks and not his substance. Because actually Paris would be a better choice for her as a husband, which is what the nurse says as well, and her mother has already told us is true. We also see in the chorus that they have some blocking forces. Romeo's blocking force, the chorus tells us, is being held a foe. He is a Montague. He is the enemy of the Capulets, being held a foe. He may not have access. He can't get to Juliet. Go talk to her. He has to climb over a wall in the middle of the night to do it. That's a blocking force. And for Juliet, her means much less to meet her new beloved anywhere. This is actually historical in that during this time period, women aren't allowed to just go and walk around on the street and do whatever they want. They're supposed to stay home. This is the 1600s in England. Of course, it's in Verona, but it's written in England. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into the act now that we've seen the chorus. Romeo meets with his friends again. He meets Benvolio, who we've met, and Mercutio in the play. And they see him and he runs off to go talk to Juliet, but these two guys are talking about Romeo and kind of wondering what's going on. And the interesting thing is that Mercutio and Benvolio still think that Romeo is in love with Rosalind. In other words, he hasn't been talking to his friends. There's just a little bit I wanted to look at here before we get to Romeo and Juliet talking, and that's just what Mercutio says around line 7 or 8 of scene 1. He says these lines, Romeo, humors, madman, passion, lover. He has these quick, different identifications of who Romeo is. There's a sense that at this point in the play, Romeo is not himself. He is many things, But later in the play, Mercutio is going to say, now thou art Romeo. So we're seeing Romeo, his character, going through a development where he's not sure who he is, but when he discovers his love of Juliet, he finds his identity. Okay, what I want to go ahead and jump forward to scene 2, and this is a very famous scene you're probably already familiar with. This is where Romeo has arrived in the courtyard of the Capulets' house, and he sees Juliet up on the balcony. This is called the balcony scene. This is actually a trope that you'll see in many movies where the guy is calling to the woman from afar in some way. So Romeo comes up and he sees Juliet standing there, and he has these lines. He jests at scars that never felt a wound. Then the stage direction tells us, Juliet appears above at a window. I want to pause here and think about the setting. How would I, if I'm the director, present this on the stage? Well, I'm going to have Juliet up here high, probably a spotlight on her, show the trees, and then Romeo down here. But maybe I want to really show the distance between them. How high do I want to put her? The second floor? The third floor? But also think about that setting there. The distance is clear between the two of them, that Romeo wishes to close that distance between them, but he cannot. That's the obstacle. But also, Romeo's down here and Juliet's up high. This is odd because we have a female character being put in this strong role of being dominant, while Romeo is submissive down here. Romeo describing her as the sun is very similar. The sun is a masculine symbol. It comes from the Greek god, Apollo, the Roman god, Phobos, which is a male god. Yet, Juliet, a female character, in this dominant role, is compared to the sun. This is interesting because it lets us see that Shakespeare is quite different from his contemporaries, people writing at the same time, in that he has many strong female characters. We have Katharina from Taming of the Shrew, we have Lady Macbeth, and here we have Juliet, another strong character. Let's also take a look at some of this imagery that Romeo presents to us. He says that Juliet is the sun, and he says, arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon. The moon would be the feminine archetype, and he wants Juliet to destroy that feminine side. In other words, he wants to empower her. That's very interesting for his love, not to make her submissive like Paris would, but to empower her. But in line 10 he says, it is my lady. Oh, it is my love. There's a sense of possession there too. So we see that Romeo is not totally giving himself over to the dominant power of Juliet, but he too wants to possess her. And later, Juliet says, I want to possess you like a tiny bird in my hand and a prisoner. He says many things that relate her to images of light. Sun, line 15, stars. Line 20, the brightness of her cheek. Line 20 carrying over, daylight doth the lamp. Light, light, light. And I had mentioned that you should look for those sort of images. And then he says to her, he listens to her speaking, and in line 28 he says, as glorious to this night, being over my head. That's a good quote if I was writing a paper to show that she's up high above him in a dominant position. And he overhears Juliet speaking, and here's what she says. She says, oh Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Very famous lines, you might have heard them before. Deny thy father and refuse thy name. And here she talks about names. And this is what I want to think about a little bit. Naming. How important is naming? Because as she says, what's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. The name is not really important. Now let's think about the characters here trying to attain their identity. They're young, trying to figure out who they are. Well, our names are not our own. Our names are given to us by our parents. So what can we do to make our name our own name? That's what Juliet is kind of crying for. Deny thy father. Deny the identity that's been placed upon you as a Montague. Throw that away and take on this new identity in my love. And Juliet needs to do the same thing. She says, 'Tis but thy name that is my enemy. Thou art thyself. That's an interesting distinction, that we are not what our parents say we are. This is a story about young people making mistakes, big mistakes actually, but in the end, they're doing what all of us try to do when we're young, which is find our own identity, or to name ourselves. As she says, what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. The name's not even important to the essence of the thing. And line 48, and for thy name, it is no part of thee. Okay, For this, I want to pause for a second to think about how language is constructed for sort of a last thought for this lesson. Language comes from us coming up with names that are absolutely arbitrary. As she said, a rose is still a rose, whether you call it something else. Romeo is still Romeo, whether you call it something else at all. However, we have a sense, we make a mistake that we think that the name is the thing. That's a mistake that Romeo and Juliet do not make, though. Juliet sees quite clearly that Romeo is not the thing we call him. And Juliet knows that he can be quite different. And Romeo knows that too, because he's not treating Juliet as her name would make her be treated, as a woman. Instead, he empowers her. She's over my head. She is not that name that was given to her by a mother, the name of a girl who should be conservative and marry someone like Paris. Okay, I want to pause here on this lesson because it's a lot to take in. And then next time, we'll continue through this when Romeo and Juliet actually speak to each other, because now he just overheard her. She doesn't even know that he's there yet. So let's do that for next time.